First of all, thank you so much for joining this Thomas Murray webinar on cyber risk for private equity. Let's get going. So, a little bit about ourselves. I'm Ed Starkie. I am part of the Thomas Murray cybersecurity team here at Thomas Murray. I lead on private equity and M&A and all that kind of stuff from the cyber perspective. Worked on lots of deals, lots of buy side, sell side, all the kind of good stuff in between. My focus very much is looking at cybersecurity from a business perspective. I'm a member of the UK-Ukraine Tech Bridge, which is a kind of a recent initiative set up with the UK government to provide support to Ukrainian companies seeking investment in the UK, and I basically help them with positioning cybersecurity. And yeah, got the Certified Information Security Manager qualification. Ben?
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. My name is Ben Hawkins, and I am a senior analyst here at Thomas Murray. I actually started my career some 15 years ago in private equity at a startup, and quite quickly pivoted into cybersecurity, leaving the complicated stuff for smarter folks. But since then, I've been through business and strategy consulting at IBM, latterly into cybersecurity, where I've worked in every possible department. I wear many hats. So I've been in incident response, forensics, e-discovery, red teaming, pen testing, social engineering, governance, risk, and compliance. If it exists, I've probably done it. So I'm somewhat of a generalist, and I have my CISSP certification, which means I'm able to give some strategic cybersecurity advice and provide that service in some sort of official capacity.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, so a little bit more about kind of Thomas Murray. But then we kind of move on to the PE kind of threat landscape. Within Thomas Murray, we've got our own kind of threat intelligence kind of function and teams. So just give you a little bit of insight about kind of what we're seeing in this space. We'll then look at kind of risk. So we'll look at kind of translating that kind of threat intelligence into risk. And then we'll look at kind of specific area of the risks. So firstly, could be direct risks, so the risks facing kind of PE themselves. And then we're looking at kind of indirect and concentration risks. So indirect, the risks facing portfolio companies, and concentration risk, which is something that we think really isn't happening very much in the PE space, but it is a growing concern for regulators and other parts of industry. So we'll then move on to looking at cyber security within as a value creation tool. And then look forward a little bit more around kind of what we're predicting in the next kind of 6 to 12 months. Wonderful. So Thomas Murray, we are a global risk consulting firm. We have lots of kind of big clients. So on the right hand side there, 140 plus, headquartered in London. I guess kind of 30 years or so, kind of been knocking around. About Thomas Murray Cyber, we are a more recent addition to the actual kind of Thomas Murray family. We've got a combined experience of 170 years. So what we've got is kind of fairly experienced individuals within cybersecurity. Lots and lots of engagements have been completed. But I think the piece that I would like everybody on the call to take away is that the three questions that we ultimately seek to answer. The what? So this is really being driven by kind of cybersecurity threat intelligence. The so what, which is kind of applying the business lens and actually saying, look, what does this mean for you as an organization, for you as a business? And that really does require working with stakeholders to understand kind of what the drivers of businesses are. And I think this is, when we're looking at kind of PE, kind of mergers and acquisitions, this is as business focused as it gets. And then the now what, which is basically giving kind of pragmatic and practical advice to organizations to improve if they like. But essentially all being driven by threat intelligence, but with a very, very practical approach. Wonderful. So PE threat landscape. I'll hand you over to Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So when we talk about threat landscape for private equity specifically, we're looking at three main tranches. We've got across the top three: the increasingly volatile cyberspace, increasingly complex supply chains, and ideologically motivated threat actors. We'll go through those one by one. So what we mean by increasingly volatile cyberspace is effectively twofold. So as technology pushes ever forward, we have things like AI and quantum computing, the Internet of Things, etc., providing threat actors with a new avenue for attack. So, AI recently has started being used to write malicious code, for example. So we're looking at that from the technical perspective and seeing that that's creating effective chaos in the world because the technology has expanded beyond our capacity to necessarily prevent it en masse. The other side of that coin is exposure to businesses that run these types of advanced technologies may have inherent risks in the fact that some of these technologies are less well tested. So AIs are still relatively new, at least the kind of large language models that are coming out seemingly every day at the moment. They're largely untested. So investments in those businesses may have an inherent risk that we're not necessarily keeping up with. And private equity being what it is, there will be exposure to these businesses. Private equity does tend to be on the cutting or bleeding edge of technology, and it's been that way for a long while. So the exposure to these businesses is a real world concern for private equity. Another piece of that is the regulation around cybersecurity and around policies and procedures and so on within the cybersecurity context. It is increasing, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the future. But generally, reacting to these frameworks and regulations coming in is complicated. They demand a lot and expect a lot, and often that's some distance above what people have implemented already. So the second piece of this landscape is the increasingly complex supply chains, by which we mean 20, 30, 40 years ago, a business might have 2 or 3 key suppliers in their supply chain, and that's kind of the broad strokes of their business. Nowadays, we see businesses with 30, 40, 50 key suppliers, whether it's email, web hosting, their cellular networks they use for their phones, the data storage capabilities they have. These supply chains are growing, and of course, each of those supply chain members has their own supply chains to deal with. So the spider web is increasingly complex. And there's an example here on the slide of DISB and the SEC being breached. So just because a supply chain is built of seemingly robust businesses, it doesn't prevent those businesses being breached and therefore by proxy affecting the company with which they have a relationship. So that supply chain complexity is increasing overall cybersecurity risk for businesses. And the final one is ideologically motivated TAs. In the past, threat actors would go after financial gain. That's the kind of the long and the short of it. Increasingly, so-called hacktivists, portmanteau, of course, of hacking and activist, are going more after businesses for political gain, whether that's just to cause chaos in foreign industries, particularly ones which have significant financial backing, such as private equity and investment banking and so on, but also as part of the propaganda campaign to show that our country can do this to another country. Looking at the alleged Russian-backed groups going after big banks after they were expelled from SWIFT after the war in Ukraine started. And indeed, these 2 examples here, although not financial services, there's been a lot of attacks against businesses who appear to support the Israeli side of the conflict against Hamas. And that's been a very prevalent issue in the last year or 6 months since the attacks began. Those are our 3 main themes that will run throughout the presentation. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Ben. So I mentioned at the beginning there are a couple of quick polls. This is our first one. So the first one really is about the use of technology as a way of creating value within your investments. It's something that we see again and again. So either a yes or a no. Fairly short, sharp. We're seeing a couple of yeses coming in, which is fantastic, which aligns with kind of what we're seeing really. Private equity, looking to increase value within an organization. Technology is one of those kind of go-to levers that you want to pull. We are seeing the rushed adoption of technology, which is increasing the risk for organizations, whether it be through their own adoption, or as Ben was saying, through kind of their supply chain. So very much an area of focus. Technology is kind of one of those drivers that will increase risk, but it's also a way of creating value. So looking at balancing those two forces is something that is complex, and yeah, we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So how are we viewing kind of risk within private equity? So we mentioned this right at the beginning, but we are looking at it from both a direct risk and indirect risk. So direct risk, those kind of threat actors that are targeting kind of PE, yeah, pretty much as it says, directly. They are going straight to the source, and I've got a couple of examples later on of PE being attacked, and you know, threat actors doing very well off the back of it. And we're also saying that within that bracket, we're saying that you can directly attack a fund by going through the third parties. They're kind of direct third parties. The indirect is what we're seeing with kind of threat actors targeting the investments. The impact of an attack on an investment, on a portfolio company, will have a knock-on impact on the PE. So very, very much of interest, but there's an element of proximity, and we'll introduce that kind of in a minute around kind of looking at the distance that PE is from the risk and the ability to influence it, and you know, the layers of complexity that come into it. Ben, I'm going to hand you over to the right hand side here, which yeah, to talk through.
So we talked kind of about threats, and now we're looking at risk factors. You know, what does PE see that other people necessarily or don't necessarily? The first one we have on the far left is the fact that investment increases the profile of an organization. So when it comes out that a business has been heavily invested with private equity money, that implies two things to a threat actor. One, change is inbound, and change often means mistakes are made. And the second is that money is inbound. And of course, that is, to a traditional threat actor, a pretty tempting apple indeed. In fact, Accenture has released information around this, saying that 68% of their private equity clients see an uptick of cyber incidents following a deal for a month. So 68% for a month see more cyber attacks, which, you know, goes to our point of if PE is making a lot of investments, that can kind of have a big knock-on impact to the investment house. The second point we're raising is the kind of multiple industrial domains piece. So if you're in car manufacturing and you see data showing that healthcare is the kind of the target du jour for threat actors, well, you can sit a bit happy knowing that somebody else is kind of taking the majority of the heat because your industry is not being targeted. Well, private equity, again, by its nature, is a cross-industrial beast. So they're exposed to all of these industries. So no matter where the threat actors are looking, that's going to affect, at least by proxy, the private equity house doing the investments. The third piece then is small to medium enterprise focus. So SMEs tend to be where the big money is made, right? In the kind of rapid expansion of SMEs. The baseline rapid expansion of those businesses can lead to lower maturity levels within those businesses. That's not of course, that's a sweeping generalization, but in general, small to medium enterprises will have a lower degree of cybersecurity maturity, just because they've had less time to implement, less impetus to do so, less cash to do so. So of course, if your portfolio is made up of these businesses, the odds of one of them having a compromise is significantly increased. And the fourth piece, kind of harking back to the first, is that there's significant business change. Of course, you know, you come in, you make your investment, you start changing stuff for the better. Well, that doesn't necessarily get regression tested against previous cybersecurity standards. So you may introduce additional vulnerabilities to those businesses by way of making business as usual changes. And the kind of resultant piece of all of that is that, you know, you can lose an investment because investments are you know, heavily driven by optics and how the public sees stuff, and therefore the value of the business. And if the value of the business goes down, of course, that impacts your loss ratios, and potentially when it comes time to fundraise, that can have an existential threat against the ability to fundraise. And saying existential threat, of course, feels pretty dramatic, but I don't think that's an opinion that's going to be proven wrong. I think existential threat is the risk of cyber threat.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ben. Cool. So very much looking at it from a risk perspective, and we've spoken about different categories of risk, and we also mentioned the idea of kind of proximity risk kind of earlier on. So the way that we are thinking about this is PE specific kind of risk, the direct risk, and that is either targeting the fund kind of directly or the supply chain. And we've got examples of multiple cyber attacks, cyber incidents, however you want to phrase it, taking place. We've listed some unfortunate victims kind of on the slide there, but this is something that is kind of continuing to evolve, continuing to develop. There's not going to be a let-off, essentially. With regards to kind of the supply chain, within PE, working heavily with third parties to provide kind of expert advice, we are seeing these providers being breached. We've got the threat intel about it's evidence of compromise being provided on the breach forums in the dark web. And then we kind of get down a little bit further where we're into kind of the portfolio side of things. And I keep on stressing it, but the proximity, you're starting to move away from the private equity house themselves into the portfolio. So again, technically you're looking at the kind of third party, and then you go down to the supply chain within the portfolio company. So looking at kind of fourth party, and this third, fourth, fifth, sixth party risk is something that's been introduced in regulation in Australia. So it's a term that I think we're going to see more and more of, and it's an area that is kind of, I guess, containing or having a really, really significant risk, particularly when we look at the very, very bottom piece, which is supply chain concentration risk, kind of in the portfolio. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in a moment, but essentially just introducing the concepts of kind of multiple tiers, multiple layers of risk kind of for PE by virtue of kind of what it is that they do. And we're seeing, I guess, more of these, I guess, previously considered kind of black swan events, where there's a significant breach that impacts lots of different organizations. So the most recent one, which is still unfolding, is Snowflake. Drop it into Google, see what's going on. It changes from day to day, but we're seeing a lot of kind of very high profile organizations being impacted by this particular breach. What makes kind of PE slightly differently, we've got an asterisk there that's highlighted the difference between the internal management, traditional kind of internal management kind of framework, and then the external kind of PE or the portfolio company framework is that kind of differentiation exists within the PE space. Most businesses, most industries will not have that level of kind of differentiation or those kind of different layers of risk and complexities. Yes, they'll have a supply chain, but they won't have the supply chain of essentially their third parties or investments. And that's the area that we're going to focus on in a second. Cool. So we're going to focus on managing the indirect kind of PE risk, which, as I said, is the risk that we see within kind of portfolio companies. However, before we do, a quick poll, if I may. So this really is just drilling down into the concentration risk and exposure across your portfolio. So quick yes or no, we're trying to make this as ed-proof as possible. If you, anybody that's worked with me before will understand that simplicity for me is often key and crucial. So yeah, if your organization is currently looking at concentration risk exposure across your portfolio. Okay, so very much balanced answers so far. So we've got I guess equal number of yeses, equal number of nos, and then a large number of you haven't answered yet. So I don't know whether to be horrendously offended or whether you're just still tucking into your croissant. But in our experience, we are seeing not as many organizations kind of looking at concentration risk as we would recommend, as we would kind of, I guess, like from a risk management perspective. So looking at the impact of indirect risk for kind of PE, what we're saying is that there is different types of risk that occur throughout the asset ownership lifecycle. So we've got transaction risk, we've got ownership risk, and we've got the exit, kind of again transaction risk, but at the exit phase. So what happens if you're not managing risk at the purchasing point, so the pre-deal stuff, before actually acquiring the business? You're buying breaches. There's an increased likelihood of kind of escrow creation, and during the remediation phase, because any breach will have remediation phase, loss of opportunity to impact investment T's and C's and fees. Bit of a tongue twister, however, there's a real opportunity when you're conducting kind of buy-side DD to really kind of use cyber as a lever to change those T's and C's. We see it lots. Buy-side DD is far more common than sell side, and it's used as an instrument by the investors to influence that particular area. Ownership, 5 to 7 years. I guess it's increasing a little bit more, but the risk will change over time as the threat landscape evolves. If you get this wrong, is all the kind of the typical kind of cyber things that you would expect. Asset value reduction, reputational harm, customer loss, lost opportunity for value creation. I think that's absolutely fundamental here. You hold these assets for a set period of time. You want to increase the value of them. You want to generate value within the organization. If there is a cyber attack, there's a diversion of resources, which has a significant impact on the potential kind of window that you have for creating that value. With a cyber attack, you often don't see the tail, I guess, the tail impact of a breach. You'll see the initial kind of notification on whatever forum is you're looking at. Organization X has been breached, but often there's months of work that take place kind of afterwards, tying up senior executives, technical resources, management. Basically, the whole business becomes involved in this fairly kind of heavy lifting activity that really everybody can do without. So lots of opportunity loss there. And then when you're looking at kind of exiting, because I guess there is that increase in the buy side, you're seeing the impact of that. So increased challenge at exit, the delays, the reduction in asset value, all stuff that is absolutely fundamental to I guess the ownership life cycle. And then lastly, at the bottom there, we've got the concentration risk, which we put in the transaction and ownership bucket. We think this is the real black swan, and we mentioned it a couple of times now. But understanding kind of supply chain concentration risk within a portfolio and looking at kind of stress testing, which we'll talk about in a minute, is how businesses such as kind of P should be looking to manage its risk. So we've spoken about it several times, we've teed it up. Now we'll go over to the concentration risk slide. Ben.
Thanks, Ed. So concentration risk we've mentioned a number of times now, but just to avoid doubt, we're talking about when a multitude of suppliers or third parties are using similar technology, or in fact the same technology. So an example might be if every investment you have uses Azure as the only hosting platform for all their services. Well, if Azure goes down for whatever reason, that implies a great deal of risk for the portfolio as a whole. Of course, Azure is unlikely to go down because you hope it doesn't, but that's the kind of concept we're talking about here. And that can be technologically concentrated. It can be industrially concentrated if all your investment is in a particular industry. As we spoke about earlier, threat actors can kind of be sheep to a degree of following each other into battle against particular industries. And so it can be basically anything concentration risk. We're talking specifically around technological concentration risk, of course, given our backgrounds. So this concentration risk piece is being increasingly looked at by regulators. So DORA, which I'm sure you're all bored of hearing about, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, apologies, another tongue twister, that specifically calls out IT concentration risk at a company level and puts in place mechanisms to manage that risk. So it's becoming more of a kind of important sticking point for regulators. And while regulation is not the be all and end all, obviously you want to be protected for your own sake. It does imply that there's a shift going on. That the risk associated with concentration risk is increasing. That's why they're starting to look at it more. And the Bank of England has also called it out as an area of concern as regards liquidity. So what's the challenge then? Well, the challenge is that in order to understand supply chain concentration risk and third-party concentration risk, in order to understand that, you need a lot of information. And that information really comes from within the portfolio companies. It's by asking questions to the right people in the right places to find the information that you need to provide that insight, and then rolling that analysis up to a portfolio level, or even to a to a fund or portfolio level, or to a business level itself. And then doing that analysis on the kind of global population of your investments, that then gives you your overall concentration risk, and that kind of provides information about how to mitigate those risks. And the second piece is, as we touched on earlier, there's cybersecurity is evolving. New 0 days, so exploits that weren't known about before, are popping their heads up everywhere. Big organizations, MoveIt, the file transfer system, for example, had a 0 day, and suddenly everyone's data was released. Okta, the big, as we touched on earlier, actually, the identity management system, that was broken into as well. So, as we diversify our technological portfolios, in the sense of suppliers, we are exposing ourselves to more and more risk, and that's what we mean by that. So what are the next steps? What do we do about it? Well, number one, we take all this information and we start analyzing it. So we look at the individual businesses, we look at the portfolio as a whole, and we start to collate that information. And then we use that information to assess the supply chain risk of the whole lot, of the whole portfolio. Looking at not necessarily just IT risk, but that's obviously where we'll focus. And looking at the concentration risk associated with focusing on particular technologies and so on, especially where private equity houses might have amalgamated the services of a number of organizations beneath them into one, so that it can more easily be managed. That's introducing a concentration risk. So doing that analysis and kind of checking those points is key piece one. And the second is this idea of stress testing, as Ed mentioned a minute ago, and we'll go on to talk about it a bit again later. Looking at the portfolio and saying, right, what happens if X happens? What happens if Y happens? Kind of running it through on a tabletop type basis, to kind of understand what the actual impact of the risk is. Quantifying risk and saying, right, well, it's this risky. It doesn't mean much, but if you say, right, but this risk has this effect, then that suddenly becomes a more detailed picture and something worth looking at. And point three, during the due diligence phase, looking at whether an additional business being merged into the portfolio is significantly affecting that concentration risk. Because if a business is pulled in, suddenly the concentration is higher and higher and higher because they're using the same technology as the existent investments. That will impact the concentration risk, and therefore impact the overall risk of the portfolio.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so the stress testing we'll come on to in a minute. It might be a term that the individuals on the call are familiar with. It's been seen in kind of the FS sector for a while, but we'll touch upon that in a second. So, keeping everybody on their toes, quick poll number 3. So, as an organisation, are you regularly conducting kind of cyber due diligence? Typically, we're looking at this from the buy side perspective. So, yes or no? It's becoming more, in our experience, what we're seeing is it's becoming kind of more and more commonplace. The reason really behind that is there's an understanding that this is a mechanism for identifying risk. Yeah, and I guess as a result of that, we'll start to see more and more and more in the sell side. We're already seeing it, but it tends to be with the more mature buyers. But I guess much like any other kind of industry, there'll be a trickle down, and we'll see it kind of become more prevalent across across the industry generally. So just watching the bars come in, it's largely balanced again, which yeah is kind of what we'd expect, what we're kind of seeing in the market generally. Thank you very much.
Ed, can I butt in and just point out there's a question in the chat
Yeah,
around
interesting.
organizations requiring to we know what requirements need to be made on vendors where they're the only supplier in the region. I'll let you speak to this in a minute, Ed, but as far as I'm concerned, if they are the only supplier in a region and therefore concentration risk exists, so for example, if they're the only ISP on an island, for example, therefore there was just an inherent concentration risk. While you might not be able to take any technological steps to kind of mitigate that specific concentration risk, you can either insure it out, which is an option, or just simply the fact of knowing there's a risk there allows you to kind of direct your focus in a particular way that allows you to be ahead of the game if any issues do arise, having backup plans and instant response plans and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think was the question in relation to kind of regulation within the particular regions and looking at it from a regulatory perspective, or is it more just kind of looking at best practice? That would be my kind of first question. So with I guess with third parties, establishing whether they're whether you've got that kind of concentration risk, whether there's the ability to switch providers. So taking a step back and looking at where we typically see concentration risk, when you're looking at the big kind of three cloud providers, so AWS, GCP, and Azure, we've seen a couple of instances now where these big cloud providers have either gone down, or there's been examples of, I think I read recently around accounts being deleted by these entities. So user accounts, so people losing all their data. Typically, organizations see those providers as safe, and they will host their environment in one of these environments, and then have their backups in the same environment. It might be segregated, but it's still within the same organization. Even with these big providers, you want to be not putting all your eggs in one basket, and taking backups, taking copies of data and putting them kind of elsewhere. So the ability to be able to move your data, transfer, and stand up your environment or whatever kind of operations you have in a separate place, separate location, in the event of I guess vendor A being impacted is fundamental. So that's one of the things that we would definitely encourage, that organizations seek to understand the ability to move vendors and kind of shift. When you're looking at kind of what's required from a regulatory, or what's required from these vendors, there'll be all kinds of mechanisms that are in place to ensure that there is a level of kind of technical resiliency in place, whether it's contractual terms and looking at having kind of uptime KPIs, that kind of thing. And that will be kind of baked into their contracts with their suppliers. So when you're talking to these vendors, actually going in and saying, look, we have a vendor risk management framework. It requires that you have particular contractual terms in place. We'd like to get some assurance that you have those controls in place as well. So we're looking at the reports that they can provide and give to the likes of yourselves as consumers, as customers of them. But it varies, is essentially the answer that I'm trying to get to from a regulatory perspective. But there's basically a shift kind of more and more. There's an understanding that from a technology perspective, the economy is driven by tech. You look at DORA, you look at kind of NIS. It's all regulatory shift and understanding, and the focus on making sure that resiliency of those kind of key technology providers is in place. Just because there's regulation in place doesn't necessarily mean that will necessarily be there. I would encourage everybody in the call to have a look at the example of a Central American country that was hit by, or that was impacted by an ISP going down, where the government of this state were unable to operate because every part of the government was using this single ISP. That's the kind of concentration risk we're looking at. That's the kind of issue that we're looking to avoid. When you've got governments going down because of a single provider going out, that's an incredible impact on the business. So yeah, understanding, getting visibility is the first step. Okay. Thank you for answering the polls, and thank you for the question. Hopefully we've kind of answered it, or at least danced around it close enough to give you something kind of food for thought. So, value creation by managing cyber risk. So, cyber for far too long, yes, has been seen as a way of kind of reducing risk, and that's exactly kind of what it's there to do in a lot of senses. But as we kind of evolve as a set of professionals, as we've become more understanding of the deal cycle, of the language that PE and I guess finance speak, we are seeing a shift towards value creation. Um, Having good cybersecurity it kind of indicates that there's other good things going on within the organization. That management have got an understanding of risk across their business. It's quite often that we go into businesses and we sit down with the CEO or the CFO, whoever, and say, like, cybersecurity risk is on your risk register. What are you doing? And if there's a blank silence, it indicates, a disjointedness, a lack of understanding of how fundamental components technology can impact the business outcome that they're trying to achieve. So often cybersecurity and an understanding of cybersecurity risk within a business is seen as a way of demonstrating good governance, good leadership, and it's, as we said, it's something that's being examined more and more and more as part of the sales cycle. So it's absolutely fundamental that this is created kind of early doors, I guess. And we've got a number of different areas that we'll talk to in a second. So drilling down into those first two phases, Ben.
So the first one I have on the screen here in the bottom left is this idea of pre-exclusivity vulnerability screening. This is just an example life cycle. Each of these services is not necessarily isolated to this point in the transaction, but I think it's a good way of highlighting what the expectation of the service is. So we're talking about prior to a transaction, you've got a set of targets. Well, the first thing you can do is have a look at them from an external perspective, do this vulnerability screening piece, making sure that their external cybersecurity is in good nick. What that allows you to do is put in appropriate mitigations, whether that's covenants and terms or insurance or whatever, or changing the finances of the deal to make sure that risk is dealt with. And the kind of knock-on impact of that is that LPs are certainly, having higher expectations of investors with regards to things like cybersecurity. So the more you can be seen to be going, right, well, we're making our assessments and making our analysis of these businesses in addition to looking at their cybersecurity posture. Well, that kind of raises the stock of the ways people see the investors. And the second piece of it then is this post-exclusivity deep dive. So as part of the kind of the deeper dive due diligence piece of the transaction, well, if you can go in and really look under the hood of these businesses in a technical way to understand not only the internal security posture, because of course we've already seen the external security posture, but looking at the internal security posture and how everything's implemented inside the business, and indeed how the leadership is driving that. That allows you to direct either funds or effort or other factors to drive the value of the business up, because increasingly cybersecurity maturity, again a tongue twister, is an expectation of somebody buying a business. So the more you can increase the posture and the better you can make the business from a cybersecurity perspective, theoretically, the higher the value.
Thank you. So the transaction's kind of taken place. You've now got ownership or partial ownership of the target or the asset. So the first thing that I guess what we're seeing kind of more and more is the ad hoc portfolio review. So we mentioned stress testing. This is as I said, something that takes place in the FS sector. The European Central Bank at the moment is stress testing a number of banks across Europe as we speak. The results are coming out fairly shortly. So this is something that we see kind of more and more. Stress testing has traditionally been not looking at cyber. The current tests that are taking place in Europe are very much focused on cyber. They are cyber stress testing. I think it's 19 banks in deep detail. And as I said, the information will be published and released. So this is something that is going to become more and more commonplace. Because of the exposure, because of the exposure to parties, because of the significant risk that exists out there. So yes, absolutely, conducting ad hoc portfolio reviews is fundamental. However, continuous portfolio monitoring or continuous portfolio risk management is, again, the real cherry on the cake. It's how you demonstrate continuous value within assets. So looking at the attack surface, Thomas Murray has a tool that does this. We have a solution where we kind of issue questionnaires and collect so we've got the outside in, then we've got the inside out view. A combination of this allows you to prioritize areas of kind of high risk within the portfolio, add a layer of kind of deal insight. So if you've got entities that are coming up to exit, you want to make sure that they are looking as good as possible. The adage that I always use is you would never sell a dirty car. So there's no different. Cybersecurity is no different to that. Making sure that pen tests are done in a timely manner, that the strategy that they had in place when you acquired them has been actioned and has been delivered, and they can demonstrate value, that cybersecurity is being built into their products, their services, their offerings, and it is, I guess, protecting long-term value. Worth noting as well, I know there has been an explosion generally in cybersecurity investments, actually investing in cybersecurity organizations. Just because they are a cybersecurity organization doesn't mean that they're good at cyber themselves. LastPass, really good example of this. Okta, some of these really, I guess, blue chip kind of cyber companies that will, their whole reputation is based on the fact that they will protect other organizations, or at least mitigate key controls or mitigate key risks through technical control implementation. Just because they are a cybersecurity organization doesn't mean they're doing it correctly. So cyber everywhere, but not a control in place. I don't know. There's going to be a better adage than that. There's going to be a better phrase, better terminology. But essentially, considering it from that perspective, go in and get it looked at. And then the sell side, we've looked at that, but streamline the offboarding process. Make sure that happens as efficiently as possible, because we know it's going to be a consideration for investors. I am conscious of time, so we will trot through the next bit. This is a little bit of kind of insight, hopefully, for individuals on the call around what we see. How are organizations going about managing risk within the portfolio? Broadly speaking, they're doing it in kind of one of two ways. So portfolio VCSO, so virtual chief information security officers, individuals within the funds or third parties. Thomas Murray again can provide the security leadership across the portfolio. So if you've got organizations that don't want a full-time security folk within their business, however, they still have risk, actually consolidating the resources and the work and saying, look, to individuals, go and provide cyber across the portfolio is something that we're seeing more and more. And then for the larger kind of funds, cyber centers of excellence. So very much the same as what we're seeing from a digitalization drive. We mentioned kind of the introduction of technology at the beginning. There'll often be those consulting teams that are formed, the operational kind of heartbeat or whatever, the operational team that go in and kind of improve organizations. We're now seeing that from a cyber perspective. Much like, I guess, IT due diligence. IT and cyber due diligence are very different. A operational technology focused part of the business, digitalization, however you want to position it, is not going to consider cyber in the same way. The reason for saying that, or at least unlikely to, is that threat intelligence is absolutely fundamental. There's a different way of thinking about things. I would encourage everybody to have a look at a recent example of an individual that was currently under investigation in the US, who was Chief Information Security Officer at a large healthcare provider. His previous experience was an SVP at Microsoft, headed up the Azure kind of data analytics side of things, and was given this Chief Information Security Officer at this kind of healthcare company. The senator that's kind of conducting this investigation at the moment has said it's categorically not the same technology does not equal cyber. This individual with all this leadership experience at Microsoft should not have had this, should not have had this position as head of cybersecurity and in a healthcare company. The example that they use is you wouldn't ask a brain surgeon to operate on your heart or vice versa. So those are the kind of positioning and understanding that we're seeing in the broader market generally. So looking forward, mentioned it a couple of times, but regulation, we are seeing more and more and more focus on kind of P generally, and looking at we're seeing noise. I guess is what we're seeing. We're seeing noise about kind of private equity and the management of risk. To date, we've seen it about the exposure of financial risk to banks. But when you combine that with the regulatory space around the focus on DORA, it doesn't, it's not massively to start considering, the focus on this concentration risk within portfolios themselves and and PE generally. So what we're saying is you need to keep one eye on this, or somebody in your organisation, intern, ideally, I guess. But just have an idea of where this regulation is going, because we do think it's going to shift fairly quickly in the future. All the mood music is changing, and it's something that we think you need to be very, very aware of. So, what to prioritise going forwards?
Thanks. So number one on a list of 8 things, I won't try and belabor the point here. I know we're short of time. But the first piece is to create a holistic cybersecurity strategies. So, we're talking about policies and procedures and all that kind of good stuff that is in line with your ESG expectations, your regulations, and your LP expectations, and so on. But really, you want to be ahead of that. You want to make those policies, make those procedures prior to those regulations and expectations coming in. Scrabbling to fix them afterwards is always more complicated. Of course, it's doable. Everyone did it after GDPR, but it's worth getting ahead of it. And further on that point, backing that up with some technical testing to confirm that those policies and procedures have been implemented correctly is of kind of paramount importance. And the second piece here is education. So when you look at things like the breach we talked about, or one of the breaches we talked about earlier, which is the Sequoia Capital breach, that was entirely down to, well, allegedly entirely down to, a phishing attack. So phishing attack, social engineering, is the kind of thing where education would have prevented or helped to prevent that issue. And if you educate the board, then that culture will eventually trickle its way down and kind of help feed everyone else. And if the people at the top are going, okay, well, we actually need to take this seriously, they can kind of push the rest of the business forward in adopting these policies, procedures, and so on. The next piece is hiring a cybersecurity focused team. So whether it's internal or external, obviously being a cyber risk consultancy, we're advocating for external, but it makes no odds particularly. You need to have a team that is focused on this kind of thing. Having the board educated is great, but having a group of people who have an appropriately wide mandate to look across the business and go, right, here are the risks, here are the points where we're vulnerable, and providing insight into how to fix those is key. And further, having an incident response team, which generally is an external party because it's something you want to call on and not have sat there the entire time. Having an instant response team to come in and fix stuff when it goes wrong, again, kind of a key piece. The fourth piece is similar to the education piece, and potentially similar to the internal side of the cybersecurity focused team, but having somebody who's an advocate for cybersecurity or an expert who can really drive the internal discussion around it, that helps everybody stay on track, because it's not a set and forget problem. This is an eternally evolving and changing landscape, and therefore having somebody who's always on top of it and always pushing is going to be critical. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you. I think there's a really good point here about the advocate, the expert. The SEC is looking at what's been said and then looking at what's being done. So actually being able to make all the right all the right noise around cybersecurity. It's fundamental to the business. It's absolutely, it's number one on our risk rate, on our risk register, and they're not having anything to back it up because you haven't got a cybersecurity focused team, because you haven't got the advocate on the board that's providing kind of regular updates and insights. Is what's being examined. It's no longer enough to say that we tried to do the right thing. It really is a case of doing the right thing. Again, looking at using legal counsel. It For this, we're looking at breaches. So if you are subject to an attack and are breached, wrapping privilege around all communications to do with that breach. Yes, it's a legal construct that's under fire at the moment. Fascinating if you like this kind of thing. Stay tuned for more blogs on this, because it really is evolving fairly quickly. But at the moment, it's still possible to wrap legal privilege around this. So you have a breach, you engage counsel, they engage forensics providers to provide that support. That support is then confidential. You have legal privilege kind of wrapped around it, so it protects your business. But engage early, because there's nothing worse than trying to engage with a third party during a breach. Harness automation, and broader technology. So this links to the very last point that we've got, really. But with the complexity that's being introduced within the supply chain and generally within cyber across the board, you can't really do it in Excel anymore. You can't really do it manually. There does have to be this element of technology. So Thomas Murray has developed platforms that absolutely organizations are using to manage risk across their organization, across their portfolio, without which it's near impossible to do. Threat intelligence. We've mentioned this several times. Threat intelligence is key. Threat intelligence is more than looking on the BBC for examples of recent breaches. It's more than having an understanding of the 0 days that have come out. It is looking at what the threat actors are doing, who the threat actors are, what techniques they're using, what's motivating them, and applying it to your business. That is absolutely fundamental, not just to your business, but then to your portfolio and across the board. So this is something that is an investment, but it feeds into everything. Threat intelligence should feed up to your board. It should feed to your cybersecurity focused team. Your advocate on the board should be able to interpret this, digest it, consolidate it, make it concise, and then pass it up, and then be able to answer additional questions off the back of it. It should help drive your cybersecurity strategy. We see threat intelligence done a lot. We see it done really badly. It's often the piece that's overlooked, because threats are, I guess, traditionally seen as very, very technical. And within the TI space, there's a tendency to want to lean towards that, technical focus, and not really bring on the business layer, the business lens. So the what, the so what, and the now what, absolutely fundamental, and it sits at the heart of what Thomas Murray Cyber is all about. Lastly, framework for managing asset lifecycle ownership. So very conscious this is PE focused. We're looking at the management of indirect risk here. Don't do it on an ad hoc basis. Do it consistently. Make sure that you have a defensible process in place that looks at risk across your portfolio in a systematic manner. You have that framework in place. You look at risk from the point, or even before acquiring an organization, through to when you divest it, and you're able to say to your stakeholders that you're managing risk appropriately throughout its life cycle. Nobody is saying that you'll never get breached, that your portfolio will be 100% safe. Nobody's saying that. What we're saying is that you need to be putting yourself in a defensible position where you are doing what is reasonable. The challenge is that reasonable test, the man on the Clapham omnibus, is increasing. The threshold is gradually increasing as cybersecurity is now a board level issue. Right, well, now the regulators are expecting the board to do something about it. Awareness is no longer enough. So put that framework in place to manage cybersecurity risk throughout the asset lifecycle. So last one, key takeaways. The role of cyber is significant within PE, both kind of indirect and kind of direct risk. It's only set to grow. Gartner is saying that 60% of transactions in was in 2025, 60% of transactions. Cyber will be absolutely pivotal to whether the investment goes ahead or not. So yeah, needs to be considered now, needs to be considered on an ongoing basis. Threat landscape, you're being targeted, say your investment, but it's changing, stay on top of it. And then the winds of change from a regulatory perspective. Yes, it's shifting. And yes, it's shifting in a way that makes it more complicated. But there's reasons for doing so. The mood music is, as we've said, concentration risk, resiliency being absolutely fundamental. But do it now before you're absolutely forced to do it. Because as we've seen with GDPR, it's best to be ahead of this thing. So, thank you for your attention. Ben, would you like to tell us all about the white paper that's coming out?
Yeah, sure, Ed. So we have this white paper, the Private Equity Guide to Cybersecurity, which contains much of the information we've crossed today, along with a threat intelligence brief, and kind of padding out some of the examples and stuff that we touched on during the webinar. Hopefully, after the webinar ends, you'll receive an email that should have a link for the deck for this and a request link for downloading that white paper should that be of interest. It's pretty in depth, and of course, I'm biased, but I think it's a pretty well written piece and very informative and educative. Anything else to add, Ed?
No, just a big thank you. Well, yes, a big thank you to everybody that's attended. A big thank you to Ben, to the wider team that sits behind us at Thomas Murray, to get this over the line. If you're interested, please drop us an email. More than happy to jump on a call to talk to individuals as and when needed, as required. But yeah, please look out for the white paper. Ben is absolutely spot on. It's a really good piece of literature that's been kind of created, and it is targeted at the industry. So really insightful, hopefully of use to everybody on the call. But unless we have any further questions, I think we are almost at time. So yeah, just a big thank you, and speak to you soon at the next one. Thank you very much.